We're going to get a little bit deep, Michael. We're going to be talking about the creative nervous system. And I'm going to have you carry the load on this one, because this is one of those ones where you need to make sure that you're walking through this with somebody who really understands it. I'm really impressed with the package you put together. So take us through the nervous system.
Okay, well, part of what we're doing is looking at how does the brain do creativity? What is it that is actually different between the human brain, which is highly creative, and some other brain that is not? And I think that's a useful way of examining this. So one of the things that we do is we look at the sea slug, aplasia, which has had a storied history in neuroscience, because it has simple nervous system with these huge neurons that you can pretty much almost take out of the body and examine. But what that indicates is that aplasia is not a very creative organism. It's only got, something like 100 different neurons. That may not be the exact figure, but conceptually that's right. So what happens when there's a stimulus that comes into the aplasia, you have almost a direct route from stimulus to response. You get a stimulation, a little blast of air, automatically the gills open up, and you have a response. And that's automatic, it's unconscious, it just happens. That's the way behavior happens with the aplasia. There are certain frogs that I hear that their huge tongues will zap out and catch a fly that goes buzzing by. But it only works if that fly is moving. If the fly is stationary on the wall, they don't recognize it as a fly. They can't be creative in that sense of, saying, oh, look, that fly is trying to hide. I got to, zap it. Once that fly starts moving, then that stimulus response triggers. What happens in the human brain, in very simplistic terms, in this model that we're doing, is you get stimulus coming in, but before you get to the response, you've got all of this activity going on of internal inputs, your memory, your emotions are going on, you're putting it into context of what's going on in the environment. So there's all of this activity that goes on, and what that actually does then is create behavioral choices. And that is one of the ways that we think, it's important to think of creativity. If you have behavioral options, then you can be creative in picking the type of behavior that actually best suits this, and you test it out. And each time you test it, the brain takes it in, remembers that, and uses that the next time you're confronted with this situation to see whether you're making a better choice or to make a better prediction about what could happen. And when you look at the human nervous system and the human brain, whereas the aplasia had 100, 200 neurons, the human brain has hundreds of billions of miniature brain cells. The nervous system is very complex. There's all this communication that's going on from the brain down through the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, hundreds of thousands of nerve cells. The neocortex, the frontal lobes of the brain, are the most recently evolved part of the brain, and it's a fascinating activity there. All of these connections between the nerve cells are where all of that communication happens and where those choices come into being. And the frontal lobes are unique in the way the wiring of the brain happens, where it is the one region of the brain that is connected to almost everything, every other part of the brain.
And Michael, the frontal lobe, we often refer to that as the CEO, and that's the command center. The other three lobes of the brain, the temporal, the parietal, and the occipital, those we see as intaking information, processing through various things like the hippocampus,
right. But
the decision maker is the frontal lobe. And let me take us back for a minute to the aplasia. That was so simple, and you described it perfectly, that the neurons were so big you can see them with the human eye. Now remember, these machines that we can now see what you're talking about with the detail of the human brain, those didn't exist in the 50s when Eric Kandel said, I'm going to work with a sea slug. Well, 50 years later, he won the Nobel Prize for Science because he was finding out what one neuron did, and now you've taken us through frogs, which are more complicated than the sea slug, and now we're moving into then the mice and the animals and now the human because of all the technology that's been here.
Yeah, an interesting point that you bring up is that any individual neuron seems to behave in basically the same way. So whether you got the one from the aplasia or the 100 billion,
any creature
behaves in basically the same way. So it's the number of brain cells and the number of little arm dendrites that stick out and the number of little synapses. You can get up to hundreds of dendrites on each cell and thousands.
And I really appreciate the way you said that it's a decision that's made by hundreds of millions or billions, whereas the species that have fewer neurons simply have fewer choices. And we're not going to get into it in this segment, but the neuroplasticity of the brain allows us to think that over time we can rewire those and make the decisions more positive.
Yeah. Well, the final point about the executive mind, as you're saying, is that it's not only connected to all of the important parts of the brain and the brainstem, but it's also the part of the brain that is most highly connected to itself. So it's like it talks to itself. It talks to the rest of the brain, talks to itself, and it's almost like that's where decisions get made, planning gets made, possibly where that, I hesitate to say that there's a location for creativity, so I don't really want to go there. But it's almost as though in the executive mind, in the frontal lobes, the decisions are being made about which choice of the multiple choices should you take, and that's really how we think the brain does creativity, is through all of these different choices.
And I'm going to end with this question, Michael. Is there a real timeline that is quantified on how long a creative process takes, or is it just depends upon all these factors?
Well, we probably should go into this more detail when we talk about the creative process, but essentially, I think the creative process can take place within a matter of seconds.
Sure, it has to.
You know, because we're making decisions all the time. And then you could look at the creative process as taking a whole lifetime. If you look at somebody like Darwin, and he went on the journey.
On the Beagle.
On the Beagle.
That's right.
He collected all this information. That's the saturation stage. You're pulling it all in. But it really was this full arc of his life. It wasn't until I think he was 50 years old that he finally
put the pieces together.
Put the pieces together and published. And then he spent the rest of his life continuing to amplify that. So his whole life is kind of this big arc of a creative cycle as well. So it could be both.
Very good. All right. That ends the discussion at this point, and we'll begin another discussion that pieces to this in a few minutes.